In the icy quiet of rural Montana, an unusual activity occurred beneath a derelict shed. The local inhabitants paid it no mind. Passers-by went on their way, but each night a solitary sound disturbed the stillness, a German shepherd, all alone, excavating the earth as if pursuing phantoms. His name was unknown. His quest remained a mystery until a 60-year-old man became his neighbor and unearthed a concealed truth connecting the dog to a soldier lost in conflict and to a bond that resisted oblivion. What they would discover together was destined to alter both their lives permanently. This is not merely a narrative of survival, it is about allegiance that transcended death, sorrow that found expression, and a love that clawed its way back from beyond. The aged farmhouse had stood deserted for many years, its roof drooping like weary shoulders, the walls shedding paint like a fading recollection striving to vanish. At the property's edge was a neglected shed, partially engulfed by weeds, its door ajar as if it had ceased contending with the wind. Most would overlook it without a second thought. Yet something within was still in motion, something animate. Each night, from beneath its decaying floorboards came the sound of claws against soil, not frantic, not hostile, but steady, deliberate, as if someone were attempting to excavate time itself. Shadow had been present for days, perhaps weeks, a German shepherd with tangled fur and a frame emaciated by starvation. The collar around his neck was so deteriorated it was barely discernible that it had once been red. One of his hind limbs dragged slightly, injured, though not recently. And yet, every night he returned to the identical spot beneath the shed and commenced digging, not for sustenance, not to elude, but for something different, something more profound. The excavation was not broad, nor was it well-formed. It resembled more a ritual, an act of desperation, unconcerned with the result, caring only about persistence. He never barked, never howled. His eyes, clouded from pain, would gaze into emptiness as he continued, paw after paw, pulling cold earth towards his chest. He possessed no blanket, no shelter from the wind that sliced through the Montana hills. But still he remained. Still he dug. Because some sorrows do not solidify, they burrow. Just beyond the property line, Walter Briggs had come back to a location he had once vowed never to revisit. 60 years of age, his face etched with sorrow and the burden of years spent attempting to forget, he stepped onto the porch of the house inherited from his uncle, a house as vacant as he felt. A firefighter once, a father once, now merely a man and his quietude. Until that initial night when the scraping commenced. At first, he mistook it for the wind, then a raccoon. But something about it felt amiss, it was too regular, too spectral. On the fourth night, he stood at his window, a mug of cold coffee in hand, and observed the shed. The wind blew fiercely. The moon illuminated the frost on the grass like scattered cinders. And there it was again, the faint, methodical scraping. He admonished himself to disregard it. Not his concern. Nothing beneficial ever arose from old sheds and broken fences. But the sound, it reminded him of something, a hospital ventilator, the slow, weary cadence of life not yet extinguished. By morning, the sound had ceased, but inquisitiveness had already taken hold. Walter traversed the property with a wary step and a cane he preferred not to use. He followed the crunch of frost-covered weeds until he reached the shed. Its door creaked more loudly than it should have. Inside, the air was damp and cold, heavy with the scent of decay and rust. He noticed the claw marks in the dirt, the way the wood above had started to bow from being scraped beneath. And then he saw the eyes from beneath the boards, two glowing, glassy orbs stared back at him. Shadow didn't growl, didn't move, just watched, daring him to see something more than a dog, daring him to remember. Walter stepped back, his heart heavy, his breath caught. That face, something about it, not just familiar, but tied to a memory that hurt too much to name. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating. The digging, the silence, the eyes, was grief starting to play tricks? Or had someone finally come back? Shadow didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head and went back to digging, the cold dirt flying behind him as if it didn't matter how long it took because he wasn't finished yet. And Walter, standing alone in the morning light, knew with a strange certainty, neither was he. The initial snowfall of the season descended like cinders from the heavens, quiet, unyielding, and frigid enough to solidify one's very thoughts. Walter sat on his porch, enveloped in a blanket redolent of aged firewood and recollection, gazing towards the shed as if it were challenging him to recall something he had long since interred. And then there it was again, the sound, not the wind, not branches, but scratching, consistent, deliberate, like a pulse beneath the floorboards. He narrowed his eyes, the world constricting with them. That evening, curiosity transformed into a resolve. Walter seized his flashlight, donned his substantial boots, and proceeded slowly across the field. Each footfall crunched with frost, each exhalation a spectral wisp of steam. He arrived at the shed, the wind incising his cheeks, and paused. Something about this location tugged at him like a connection to a chapter he had concluded too hastily. The flashlight flickered as he stepped inside, the beam illuminating broken implements, rusted nails, and finally those same eyes, two dull embers observing him from beneath the warped planks. And this time he did not avert his gaze. He dropped to one knee, prying at the wood, disregarding the sting in his back and the ache in his knees. One board yielded with a loud crack. Beneath it, in a shallow excavation shrouded in filth and frost, lay the dog, Shadow, as thin as a secret, trembling yet unafraid. Not wild, not aggressive, just broken. His fur was torn. A scar traversed his left shoulder as if someone had taken a blade to destiny. One of his ears twitched. The collar on his neck hung like a noose from the past. Walter remained silent. Words felt futile here. Instead, he lowered the flashlight and let it rest on the ground, allowing the soft beam to settle on the dirt. Shadow did not flinch, he merely stared. And in that stare, Walter perceived it, that impossible, maddening glimmer of recognition, a face he believed he would never behold again, enveloped in fur, pain, and silence. Later that evening, Walter returned, bringing a bowl of eggs and some shredded hot dogs. He positioned the sustenance near the shed entrance and retreated, observing from the shadows. Shadow limped forward with a wariness cultivated by years of mistreatment. He sniffed, paused, then consumed the offering as if it might vanish. Yet he did not flee, nor did he growl. He remained near the shed, glancing towards Walter's silhouette as if evaluating risk or recalling trust. This became their pattern. Each night, Walter brought something: food, a blanket, an old shirt. Shadow never strayed far from the shed. He wouldn't step onto the porch, wouldn't cross the unseen boundary that demarcated where he once belonged. However, he ceased digging for a few nights, stopped clawing at the earth as if it concealed answers. And then, just as Walter believed progress had commenced, Shadow returned to the excavation and resumed his efforts, this time with greater speed and desperation. Walter stood at the window, his fists clenched. What was he digging for? Not escape, he could have departed by now. Not food, he had that. No, it was something interred, something he hadn't relinquished. And then it struck Walter like a slow-motion blow to the gut: the dog. He resembled Bravo, his son's K9 from years prior, the one that never returned from deployment, the one his son Jeremy had trained, cherished, relied upon, the one who vanished the same day the folded flag arrived at his doorstep. The very notion felt preposterous, unattainable. Yet Walter couldn't dismiss it. There was something in those eyes, something that tugged at a part of him he'd spent years attempting to forget. He turned from the window, his mind reeling. And just before sunrise, he murmured aloud, "Is it truly you?" Shadow offered no response, but as the first light pierced the sky, Walter observed him extract something from the earth, a small, rusted object. And the instant he saw it, everything froze. The wind howled that morning as if it had a confession to make. Walter stood just inside his back door, fingers clenched tightly around a chipped mug, gazing across the frosted field towards the shed. Something had altered, the dog's energy, his purpose. It was no longer mere survival, it was an obsession. And then came the moment that halted everything. Shadow had ceased digging. For the first time in days, he paused, sniffed at something in the dirt, and carefully extracted it. It was small, metallic, and coated in soil. He limped forward and gently deposited it just outside the shed like an offering. Walter approached, his heart pounding without his consent. He knelt, brushing the object clean with trembling hands. It was a military dog tag, fractured cleanly down the middle, rusted around the edges, but unmistakably genuine. On it were 3 letters stamped deeply into the metal: JB. Walter's throat tightened. His son's initials, Jeremy Briggs. The remainder of the tag was corroded, but a fragment of a unit number still adhered to the bottom edge, just enough to stir a tempest within him. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His mind traversed years, collapsing time into a single point, the day 2 soldiers had appeared at his door in pressed uniforms, holding a folded flag and an expression that conveyed everything without needing words. They had stated Jeremy died in an ambush, that Bravo 7, his K9 partner, was also presumed Kia. No remains, no body, no genuine closure, just silence, years of it. And now, from frozen earth and impossible odds, a tag had surfaced like a whisper from the grave. Shadow stood nearby, observing Walter with those same eyes, those deep, aching wells that seemed to contain too many lifetimes. There was no bark, no tail wag, just a heavy stare, as if he were waiting for Walter to comprehend. And Walter did. He took the tag inside and placed it beside the only photograph he still kept framed. Jeremy in uniform, one hand gripping a young German shepherd's collar. Walter stared between the photo and the dog outside, his breath catching. The markings matched, the scar across the shoulder, even the ears, one tilted slightly inward. It couldn't be. But it was. This was Bravo 7. Shadow hadn't been digging for food. He hadn't been escaping. He had been mourning, remembering, holding vigil in the one place he returned to after the war, this shed on this land where Jeremy once played as a boy. Perhaps he had brought him here once. Perhaps the scent lingered. Perhaps the memory never departed. Walter walked back outside, stepping slowly towards the dog who had every reason to fear humans yet didn't flinch as he approached. He knelt again, closer this time, and extended his palm, not demanding, just offering. Shadow stared for a moment, then inched forward and pressed his snout into Walter's hand with the gentleness of someone afraid of breaking something sacred. Walter didn't speak, just let the tears fall, mixing with the dirt, the snow, and the weight of a reunion too long delayed. But the peace was short-lived. A sound ripped across the air like a blade, distant but unmistakable, gunshots, far off, perhaps from the hills. Hunting season had commenced again. But Shadow heard it differently. To him, it wasn't just noise, it was war. It was chaos reborn. His body snapped into panic, instincts overriding all else. He bolted, running past Walter into the woods behind the field faster than any wounded dog had a right to move. Walter shouted his name, a name he hadn't uttered aloud in over 7 years, Bravo. But Shadow was gone, swallowed by trees and memories. The grave still sat beneath the shed. The tag still rested in Walter's pocket. But the dog had run back into the darkness. And Walter, with trembling hands and a fire in his chest that hadn't burned in years, turned back towards his house and grabbed a flashlight. He wasn't losing him again. The trees engulfed him completely. Walter forced his way through the dense undergrowth with a resolve that made every bone in his body protest. The flashlight beam quavered with each footfall, slicing through the mist like a blunted instrument. Snow adhered to his boots, his breath emerging in ragged gasps. He was uncertain of his destination, only that he was advancing. Shadow was out here somewhere, alone, injured, and re-experiencing a war that had never truly ended. He paused at an opening in the woods, searching for paw prints. There, in a soft patch of snow near a fallen log, was the impression of a body. Shadow had stopped here. The snow around the spot was agitated. Dirt, blood, and something else, shredded fabric, a strip of canvas, weather-beaten, just barely visible beneath the snowbank. Walter knelt and tugged it free. A satchel, old, faded. The strap was frayed as if chewed or torn, and the buckle had rusted almost entirely through. With his gloves, his fingers growing numb, Walter fumbled with the latch. It sprang open with a brittle snap, and inside, folded but water-damaged, was a photograph. He extracted it slowly, apprehensive that it might crumble in his grasp. The image, though marred by time, was unmistakable. Jeremy, in uniform, sporting that characteristic half-smirk he always wore when feigning indifference. Beside him, kneeling at attention, was Bravo, the same scar, the same eyes, the same allegiance preserved on film. Walter sank onto the log, clutching the photograph as if it were his sole anchor. He had not encountered this image before, it was not among Jeremy's possessions returned from overseas. So why was it interred here? And then it dawned on him, Shadow had buried it or perhaps unearthed it. A sound in the distance jolted him back to the present, a rustle, a low, broken whimper. Walter rose swiftly, pursuing the noise until the flashlight beam caught 2 luminous eyes beneath a splintered pine. Shadow lay curled, his body pressed against the roots, one paw lifted and bleeding from something sharp. He made no attempt to flee, he simply looked up, his body succumbing to exhaustion, but his spirit clinging on by a mere thread. Walter hurried to his side and dropped to his knees, the snow burning through his jeans. "Easy, boy. Easy." Shadow whimpered again, pressing his head against Walter's chest. Walter enveloped him in his arms, awkward and unsteady, as if endeavoring to hold onto time itself. "You came back. You truly came back," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. And then, a change. Shadow's tail, still and lifeless all these days, gave a slow, tiny wag, barely perceptible, but it was something, a signal, a message. Walter looked down at the bleeding paw, a hunting trap and not a humane one, rusted, jagged, likely illicit. Someone out here had set it and Shadow had walked directly into it. Yet he had persisted. Yet he had carried the photograph. Yet he had striven to find his way back. It was loyalty in its most unadulterated, most heart-wrenching form. Walter eased the paw from the trap, wrapping it in his scarf. Shadow whimpered once more but did not resist, he simply allowed him to do it, allowed him to care, allowed him to assist. With the satchel slung over his shoulder and Shadow cradled against his side, Walter commenced the arduous journey back. Each step was more challenging than the last. The snow deepened, the sky darkened, but they moved together. Midway through the woods, Walter felt it, a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years, a purpose that didn't feel like a penance, a second chance. He looked down at the dog, this battered survivor who refused to relinquish the past. "Let's go home, Bravo." It should have concluded. The trap had been disarmed, the satchel retrieved, the photograph placed in trembling hands. Shadow should have been on the path to recovery. Yet, destiny has a way of challenging even those who have already endured the unimaginable. And that challenge arrived more swiftly than anyone could have foreseen. Hours after Walter brought Shadow home and swathed his injured paw in warm gauze, the sky ruptured again. Not with snow, but with sound sharp, sudden. The reverberation of a distant gunshot rolled across the hills like thunder on a battlefield. It wasn't proximate, but it was sufficient. Sufficient to reactivate whatever memories were deeply embedded in Shadow's psyche. The tremor commenced in his hind leg, then surged through his entire frame. His ears flattened, his respiration altered, and before Walter could intervene, Shadow bolted. Not from fear, but from instinct. He ran like a soldier awakening from a dream into a nightmare. Walter shouted, dropping the kettle he had just filled, and limped out the door, his heart thudding so violently it muffled his hearing. "Bravo! Shadow!" No response, just the diminishing crunch of snow beneath desperate paws. And just like that, Walter found himself back in that same powerless position, the same one he occupied years ago when a knock on the door informed him his son would never return. Only this time, something within him fiercely resisted. Not again. Not this time. He seized the flashlight, donned the same coat he had worn when rescuing people from burning buildings during his firefighting days, and pursued him. The cold was biting, searing his throat, but Walter did not stop. Could not. Every snap of a twig or flicker of movement sent adrenaline coursing through veins that hadn't pulsed with such intensity in years. His cane sank into the snow with each stride, but it did not impede him. If anything, it provided a rhythm to his urgency. He located the first sign of Shadow's trail near the northern treeline. A streak of disturbed snow leading into denser undergrowth, then blood, mere drops at first, crimson against white, like punctuation marks in a narrative that refused to conclude. Walter's heart sank, but he pressed onward. The trees grew thicker, branches clawing at his coat. The flashlight flickered with every jolt, but he did not turn back. Not when he heard it. A low, pained growl. Walter turned sharply, directing the light towards the sound. There, wedged beneath a fallen pine, half buried in frost and panic, was Shadow. One leg bent unnaturally, his body trembling. He was attempting to move but could not. The paw that had just begun to heal was torn open again. The trap had inflicted more damage than they had realized. Perhaps a muscle tear, perhaps something more severe. His breath came in short, harsh gasps. Walter didn't speak immediately. He knelt, disregarding the fire in his knees, and reached out slowly. "You found your way back once. I'm not letting you go again." Shadow didn't resist. He pressed his head into Walter's chest as if it were the only sanctuary in the world. And for a moment, man and dog remained thus, in the darkness, enveloped by cold and silence and everything they had both lost. But they couldn't linger there. Walter removed his coat, wrapped it tightly around Shadow's frame, and began clearing branches from the fallen pine. Every movement was agonizing. Every breath felt borrowed. But step by painful step, he lifted Shadow free. They moved slowly, Walter half carrying, half supporting the weight of the dog who had once survived a battlefield, a betrayal, and years alone in the wilderness. The journey back felt like miles, but together they made it, collapsing just feet from the cabin steps. Walter's voice was barely a whisper. "Help, please," and the universe, for once, responded. A snowplow crested the hill just as Walter lost consciousness, its beams cutting through the morning gray like a lighthouse in the storm. Inside was Frank Howard, Walter's old firefighting partner, retired but still monitoring the back roads. Frank jumped out, saw the crumpled figures in the snow, and rushed to them. "Walter! Jesus! What the hell happened?" Walter could barely lift his head. "The dog! Get him to the vet, please." Frank didn't ask questions. He just scooped Shadow up, laid him in the truck bed, and helped Walter into the cab. As they sped off towards town, Walter clutched the photo he'd stuffed into his coat pocket. Jeremy and Bravo, side by side, frozen in time. He whispered to the wind, "He came home, but he's not safe yet." The old vehicle thundered through the early morning mist as if it bore an urgent disclosure. Frank drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze shifting between the rearview mirror and the path ahead. In the back seat, Walter leaned against the window, his coat drenched, lips pale, his heart thudding with the kind of panic only a subsequent loss can evoke. And beside him, enveloped in a flannel blanket and barely respiring, was Shadow. His eyes flickered open periodically, just long enough to glance at Walter to reassure him of his continued presence. But the color of his gums, the slow rhythm of his chest, it all signaled critical urgency. Walter held onto the satchel like a flotation device, the photograph of his son and Bravo clutched to his chest. He uttered no words, offered no prayers. He merely stared at Shadow and whispered, "Don't make me inter both of you." When they skidded into the parking lot of Dr. Mason Keller's veterinary clinic, the sun had barely crested the mountains. Walter and Frank rushed to the door, Shadow limp between them, the bell above the entrance clanging like a fire alarm. Mason was already present, an early riser, a retired Army veterinarian, and the only individual in town Walter trusted with something so delicate. What transpired? Mason inquired as he dropped his coffee and cleared the examination table in seconds. "Trap," Frank grunted. "He's been limping for days." Then it tore open again. "Lost a significant amount of blood." Mason nodded and rolled up his sleeves. "Get him up here now." As they lifted Shadow onto the table, Walter placed the dog tag on the counter. Mason's hands froze mid-motion. He stared at the letters. "Is this?" Walter gave a small nod. "That's him. It's Bravo 7. Mason blinked hard and then commenced his work for fluids, injections, sterilized wraps. He moved like someone whose hands had performed this task too many times before, yet never for a dog like this. Shadow didn't whimper, didn't growl, he just lay there, trusting, as if he knew this wasn't the conclusion. But then Mason peeled back the old gauze. His expression shifted. "This leg is worse than I thought," he said. "Ligament damage, infection starting. He's got a bullet scar under the shoulder, too. Old one." The report from Kandahar said Bravo 7 took shrapnel. "This matches." Walter gripped the counter. "Can you save him?" Mason didn't answer immediately. He looked at the dog, this warrior, this ghost, and nodded slowly. "I'm not letting him go down after surviving all that." Hours passed. Frank stayed, brought more coffee, said nothing. Walter sat in the waiting room, his thumb rubbing the edge of the dog tag as if it were a worry stone. His mind swam with memories. Jeremy teaching Bravo hand signals in the backyard, the day the letter came, the silence that followed. And now this, the chance to save what little was left, not just of his son, but of himself. Finally, Mason emerged from the exam room. "He's stable. He's not out of the woods yet, but that dog." He let out a breath. "He's built from something stronger than most men." Walter stood, his legs nearly giving out. "Can I see him?" Mason nodded. "He's awake barely, but he's looking for you." Walter stepped inside. There, on the padded bed, was Shadow wrapped in fresh bandages and Ford dripping into his foreleg, eyes barely open. But they saw him. They recognized him. And when Walter knelt beside him, the dog did something he hadn't done since returning. He licked Walter's hand, not out of instinct, but gratitude. Walter couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam inside him finally gave way. Tears streamed down his cheeks, onto the blanket, into Shadow's fur. "You made it home. You actually made it." Shadow gave a quiet sigh and rested his head against Walter's arm. And for the first time in years, Walter Briggs didn't feel like a man haunted by what he'd lost. He felt like a man finally holding on to what he still had. Shadow returned home with a limp, a shaved area on his leg from the medical procedure, and a list of instructions longer than Walter's grocery bill. Yet, what truly mattered was not contained in the documents, it was in the way he surveyed the cabin, as if he had been there previously, as if he were finally secure. Walter spread out an old woolen blanket beside the fireplace. He added a second one for good measure, then slid over a bowl of broth that smelled of patience and salt. Shadow did not hasten to eat. He settled down with a grunt, extended his legs cautiously, and closed his eyes. Not in pain, but in relief. The house transformed with his presence. The silence that once felt oppressive became comforting. The space that once echoed now seemed to breathe. Walter found himself conversing again, not with people, he still wasn't prepared for that, but with Shadow about anything and everything. about firehouse anecdotes, his first automobile, the time he forgot his wedding anniversary and ended up purchasing a toaster as a peace offering. Shadow listened in the manner of dogs, as if every word were sacrosanct. Days turned into weeks. Mornings commenced with medication. Afternoons were tranquil strolls just beyond the porch, where Shadow could sit and feel the breeze. Walter started reading aloud from Jeremy's old journal, pages filled with thoughts and lessons scribbled amidst sandstorms and gunfire. Shadow would tilt his head every time he heard Jeremy's name, as if the words still held a profound, deep-seated meaning for him. Healing wasn't merely about mending bones. It was about rebuilding trust, one gentle moment at a time. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was Mason, the vet, carrying a small bag of follow-up medications and a curious smile. Behind him stood a woman and her daughter. Both had heard the story. Walter was hesitant. He disliked visitors. But Shadow surprised him. The moment the little girl knelt, Shadow stepped forward slowly, gently, and laid his head in her lap. She giggled. Her mother gasped. And Walter, well, he didn't say much. But when the girl remarked, "He feels like a hero," he smiled more broadly than he had in a decade. Word spread. People began leaving notes on the porch. Small treats, cards, even drawings from school children depicting Shadow wearing a cape. Walter pinned them on the refrigerator. It was absurd, and it signified everything. But the most significant transformation occurred one snowy morning. Shadow stood at the back door and pawed at the wood. Walter opened it, anticipating a stretch, a sniff, perhaps a quick outdoor break. But Shadow didn't move far. He limped towards the shed, that old, crumbling shed. He paused at the doorway, then turned back and looked at Walter. So Walter followed. They stepped inside side by side. Shadow padded to the dirt and pawed gently, not to dig, but as if he were saying goodbye. Walter stood in silence, allowing it to happen. Then Shadow backed away, sat beside him and simply stared. No more need to dig. No more graves to uncover. Whatever he had returned for, he had found. That night, Shadow slept curled beside the fire, not twitching, not whimpering, just still, peaceful. And Walter, sitting in his armchair with a cup of coffee and Jeremy's journal on his lap, looked over and whispered, "You brought him home, didn't you?" Shadow didn't move, but he didn't need to, because sometimes the most resonant answers arrive in the quietest rooms. The snow had started to recede by the time Walter took up the hammer. Spring had not yet fully arrived, but the ground was no longer frozen. The chill still lingered in the mornings, yet there was sunlight now, longer, warmer, more lenient. Walter stood behind the old shed, the same location that had once echoed with desperate digging. And now it held something far more serene, peace. With careful hands, he drove a post into the earth beside the spot where Shadow had once clawed for meaning. On that post, he affixed a hand-carved plaque, sanded and stained with affection, its letters deeply etched into the wood. For Jeremy Briggs and Bravo 7, bound by honor, united by love. Shadow sat a few paces back, observing. His healing leg was bandaged, but he moved with increased strength now, more purpose. And as Walter stepped back to admire the marker, Shadow limped forward and lowered himself at its base, resting his chin in the dirt as if the task were finally complete. They remained thus for a considerable time, man and dog, both quiet, both transformed. That grave hadn't held a body. It had held something else. Memory, loss, love, duty, and now, finally, closure. Back in town, people had begun calling Shadow a miracle. Children from the local school sent crayon drawings of him. A boy had even composed a poem titled "The Dog Who Came Back." Walter kept it all. He wasn't one for attention, but this story no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to every individual who had ever lost something they believed they would never find again. A few weeks later, Walter and Shadow commenced visiting the local Veterans Center every Thursday afternoon. They didn't go to heal others, they simply sat there together while others talked or didn't. Shadow would nudge the hands of men who hadn't spoken in years. He'd rest beside women who carried pictures in their wallets they could no longer bear to look at. And somehow that dog, scarred, steady, silent, did more good than 1,000 conversations. One day, a man asked Walter, "Why do you still call him Bravo?" Walter looked down at the German shepherd curled at his feet. "Because he still answers to it." Home life settled into something resembling normalcy. Mornings began with fresh coffee and Jeremy's journal, which Walter now read aloud. Shadow listened as if he understood every word. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, Walter humming songs from his firehouse days while Shadow lay at his feet, his tail gently thumping with the rhythm. One night after dinner, Shadow got up and walked towards the back door, not with urgency but with intention. Walter followed, grabbing his coat. They walked slowly to the shed one last time. Shadow circled the grave marker, then lay down beside it, not with grief but with reverence. He looked up at Walter once, then rested his head on his paws. Walter didn't say a word, he just sat beside him in the grass, his back leaning against the post. They stayed that way until the stars blinked awake. In that stillness, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just settled. Shadow eventually rose, stretched, and nudged Walter's knee with his nose. Then they walked back to the house together, side by side. That night, Walter slept with the fireplace low and Shadow curled up in his usual spot. No nightmares, no digging, just the soft crackle of logs and the steady breathing of two souls who had finally made it home. And in the hush between the flames, the journal pages, and the heartbeat of a dog once lost to war, a truth settled into the air like falling ash. Some heroes don't return to applause or medals. Some just find their way back through the snow, carrying pieces of the past, and give us one last chance to make peace.